My name is Brenda, but my friends call me Katu. I come from Kenya, Nairobi. We moved to Nairobi, I think, when I was 3 years old. But yeah, that's where I've had all my formative experiences, and that's where I consider my home to be. I mean, I think of home, especially living away from my family for the past almost 5 years. Moving away from home made Kenya home in a way that I hadn't m- maybe thought of it as before. Just this kind of like the place in which I'm very rooted. I think, of course, about family, friends. I think about Friday nights in the club. I think, you know what? I think I've never had like party experiences anywhere else that I have in Kenya, and I always when I go back home, I'm always trying to kind of like recreate that moment might have passed. I don't think I can party the way I used to party when I was 20 or 18, but I still think of that when I think of home. And the food, of course, as well, and just, I guess, just like the comfort of being around my loved ones. Yeah. In terms of like landscapes of like the country versus other places, I think Kenya is like a super diverse country. There's places I myself haven't been that I really want to visit. But that's not what I find super distinctive. I think what I find very distinctive is the people, like our culture. I like to say that like I'm culturally Nairobian because I think that's very like distinct and different from anything else. I think the experience of like what it is to like live and grow up in that city, as well, and its histories. Obviously, it's super cosmopolitan, so you have people coming in from different parts of the country, and like in Nairobi, we have like what we call Sheng. It's not really like a patois, but it's like a language that is kind of like a mix of English, Swahili, and some like mother tongue tribes as well. It's sort of like the language of the city. It's very youthful, but I don't know, even the cadence of it, it's like a little sharp but a little bit musical. The words always have some very interesting intonation. I like to like for example, sunglasses or glasses is like madigaga. I don't know, the way it sounds to me. I like the sound of it in my ears. There's a certain pace to the city that feels like unrelenting, but also a certain kind of like playfulness as well. And I think that mix, that bust of everything is what I think about. I always had this idea that certain places, especially like in the West, were a lot less patriarchal, for example, than like a lot of places back home. But I've actually come to realize after living away from home for a while that Kenya is one of the places in which women have a lot of freedom and a sense of personal self and identity. And like that's quite normal. I think it's quite remarkable that when I was graduating from my undergrad from varsity, what my mom said to me at my graduation party was like, "Don't get married quick. Like, make sure you get a job and enjoy your money." And I think now when I think about that, it's the aunties that I know. A lot of women are told even when they're getting married to like make sure you have a piece of land for yourself or like have some property for yourself. And so I feel like women are very we're expected to like be our own people in a way, or we're allowed. There's more of a space for it, and that makes me feel, I think, in some ways, very very proud of being Kenyan. I'm not saying that we have everything figured out, but I do think that in a lot of ways, our society has really worked in certain ways to like make room for women. If you look at like the Kenyan independence struggle, it was a struggle for land because Kenya was a British settler colony. And you see the thread of that until today. I remember when I lived in South Africa, I was quite surprised that friends my age who had property didn't own land because as a Kenyan, it's like when you get some money, you're going to buy land. So we think a lot about land, and the idea of owning a patch of something for us is so important. I think obviously coming from the history of that land being taken away from us even today, it's like something that's really aspirational, but still it's one of the places in which like I said, it's a piece of property that everybody wants to own and everybody works to own a piece of land, but also there's a lot of corruption around it that goes as far as like government in terms of like even how to confirm that the person that's selling the land to you owns the title deed. It's a place of deep aspiration, There's the history, obviously, of the struggle for independence and colonialism is obviously still there. And you see that carrying into today with like the tension around sort of like owning the land. And I think the other thing is that land in Kenya tends to be quite expensive compared to a lot of other places, like South Africa, for example. And so obviously that takes the cost of everything else quite high up. When it comes to agriculture, I think that's like a very interesting one. I think, for example, like when I think about my friends from varsity, there was always this idea that like if things don't work out like in the big city with the corporate jobs and all of that, that like you could go and like be a farmer. And I think I have a lot of friends now that have big fancy corporate jobs, but have a farm somewhere that they're like, you know, growing something, maybe selling to the export market or maybe, you know, to the local markets. We have like this kind of like politically connected families that tend to control a big chunk of kind of like, let's say, the profitable kind of like agriculture. We're a big like coffee producing nation, we're a big tea producing nation. But even if you look at the history of that, you know, we've had instances where farmers were pulling off the bushes because we're not making you know, like the coffee bushes or tea bushes off the ground because they were not making money off it and it was illegal to do so. Like you could literally end up in jail. So the agricultural history, I think, also it's quite connected to like the history of colonialism as well. The access to land, who owns land, who doesn't own land, and what can you do on the land as well. It's a very interesting one. And the last thing I wanted to say is that like I didn't do agriculture in school because I thought it was so boring. But now that we're having this conversation, I'm actually seeing how much of a terrace thing it is, you know, like a very, because it's about how does a country fit itself, who makes the money from it, who has the excess, and how much is grown for export versus how much is grown for local consumption, and who gets to eat what. Because, you know, a lot of times also like the prized stuff for export markets is not necessarily the quality that you find. But overall, I want to say that I have found that a lot of places that I have been in the world, that the quality of organic food that we get back home is really, really good and quite affordable. So that's something I hope it will stay that way. But that's one of the things I really appreciate about home. We often joke about it that we don't spice our food a lot, but I think part of the reason is like the quality of the raw ingredients for me is so good that you often don't need to do too much to get some flavor from the food itself. I feel like I had a very like city lifestyle, city upbringing. And when I hear that question, my first instinct is to think about something like supposed to be like culturally traditional. But actually, when I thought further about it, I think the big tradition of like going home to like my grandfather's, like where my mom grew up, the village, I guess, um, going there like once a year, usually around Christmas in December. That like when I was a child, I was like, oh, all the cool kids are in Nairobi and like we're going to the village. This is not fun. I'm not going to have fun stories to tell when school opens because everybody will have had like this fun city experiences and I will have been like in the village. But now when I think about it, it was actually so precious because I got to experience a different lifestyle in Kenya. One of my like earliest memories is spending a big chunk of my December holidays with my grandfather. And because my parents are from two different tribes, so they spoke to each other in Swahili and English in the house. So I only spoke Swahili and English. And when I went to the village, I was playing with I went outside to play with other kids my age, and they only spoke. It was my mom's side, so they only spoke. My mom is Kisi or Abagusi, so the kids only spoke Kisi, and I was a bit of like an attraction because it was like this little kid speaks English and Swahili. Because usually people learn at least English when they go to school and they speak Swahili and maybe a mother tongue before. So I was a little bit, especially in the village. So I was a little bit like of an attraction, but it's like a very different life that it's complicated because when I was younger, like I said, I was like, oh, I'm not going to have cool stories. It was a lifestyle that I think I thought wasn't as cool or as interesting. But as I grew older, I'm so grateful that I got to have those moments because you get to see the a lot of the food that we eat, grown right there on the farm. It's also very beautiful. Like you see, it's quite hilly, like Rwanda, and very green. And has all this, like, so when you're driving on the road, it's like winding roads with like just like views of all of the green, and it's a tea growing area, so it's like just rows and rows of like tea bushes. It's like one of my favorite trips to make when I go home now, and to just like slowly drive through there. So I think now that it's so special that I got to have those, those moments and experience like a different phase of life, and also just like the stories and the culture there. It's like it's different. If I'm out late at night in Nairobi, my mom would say to me that like somebody would steal me, right? But if I was in the village, and I was out late at night, it would be like a witch would get me or something like this. So also for me, like, and that's not true for every community, but like, in my community, there's a lot of stories of like of witches, which I personally really love. Also, that, like, I guess being exposed to two different worlds with like different like stories, different fears, maybe different ethos, and also for me to see like my grandfather, because he had a very different life, because he lived through colonialism. So, speaking to him, like he's had very different experiences of Kenya. And then with my mom, who grew up in the village and came to Nairobi for varsity, and then me, who essentially grew up in the city, like we have very different, like, kind of like experiences of these places. And I think going home to be with my grandfather, and it felt like I was reaching back and understanding the country and the history in a very kind of like intimate way. So I think that was also very special. So in Kenya, we have Swahili, which is a national language, and I won't say everybody speaks it, but I think that if you go to like some very remote villages, very elderly people might not speak it. They might only speak the mother tongue. But I want to say like 99% of Kenyans speak Swahili. And then the official language is English. So it's like the language of business. I have a friend who's Swahili, like Swahili tribe, and she was talking about some of her frustrations of when your mother tongue is nationalized, because then everybody feels like it's their language in certain ways. She sometimes, gets criticism on the way she's speaking, from people for whom it's not their native language, which is like a very interesting thing. She's a writer, and she writes a lot in Swahili. So I think, it also greets her in a very specific way. So I think there's that aspect, which when she spoke, I was like, I would really like to know what is this experience of the Swahili people, of their language being nationalized. I have here, of course, one experience. But on the other hand, like, I really love that, like, we have an African language that we can all communicate with. And the thing about Swahili is that it's not spoken only in Kenya, it's spoken in Tanzania. It's spoken in Uganda, not as much, but it's spoken in Uganda, in Congo, in Malawi as well. There's a language close to Swahili. I forget the name, that's spoken in, I think it's called Unguja, that's spoken in the Comoros as well. So it's widely spoken across Africa, and I I like that. I remember like going to a barber shop. I think it was in Johannesburg, and I was speaking to somebody on the phone in Swahili, and like a Congolese guy walked up to me, and he was super excited because he was like, "Oh, like, where are you from?" and was very excited to speak. The thing is, there are many Swahilis, so Kenyans are always laughing at like Congolese Swahili, because they replace a lot of like W with B, and the cadence of it is different. The cadence of the Swahilis are very different. What I hear is that Kenyan Swahili, especially the urban Nairobi one, which is different from the coast, it's like very, maybe a bit choppy, a little bit. It's musical in a different way. It's like maybe like hip hop or rap versus the Swahili spoken on the coast and in Zanzibar and Tanzania. It's a little bit more like Tarab music, so it's a little bit more softer in places. But I love that we have a language that we can all connect on. That's an African language. I want to go back and read like what the history of the nationalizing it was. Ideally, it should be one of those things that like should make us a lot like less tribalist. Um, but I don't think that it does that. I guess it's too much to ask of one language or to ask of one thing. But I really love the experience of like, because I've lived in Tanzania and I've visited a number of times, been to Uganda, I've been to Malawi, and somebody spoke to me in Swahili as well. There's a bit of magic like when I'm in another country and I'm able to speak to another African and we're able to connect and we're speaking in an African language that always just makes my heart beam. And so I'm always like, and I think I read somewhere a while back that South Africa had decided to start teaching Swahili in their schools. And I mean, of course, I'm a little biased, but I really love the idea of like an Africa connected by one language that we can all speak and share. That's an African language. You know what I mean? One last thing I want to say about Swahili is that like, so obviously we learn it in school as a subject like with English, and the grammar of it is actually a little bit like, it's intense. It's a little bit like French. There's different tenses for different objects. You know, for a chair it's different from a person, for example, so you have to like remember all of that. But now, like for example, back home, the 7 p.m. news will usually be in Swahili, and then the 9 p.m. news will be in English. And things like those that I've always taken for granted as kind of like how the world works, I'm realizing now those are policy decisions. And I think it's really great that those decisions were made, because I think it's just really beautiful, and culturally it means that we're able to retain something of ourselves, especially in a world that's becoming increasingly kind of like monotonous, you know, with like Pinterest and social media and all of the stuff. It's beautiful, but you find kind of like one style or one culture or like one look, even with fashion, like, you know, it's kind of like this is what's in fashion, and everybody everywhere in the world is more is, you know, looking more and more the same. I like the idea of like this little policy decisions that kind of like help us to retain parts of our identity and our cultures. Okay, so the last like 2 3 years I only go home like usually once a year around in December. And I love to spend a very lazy Sunday afternoon in my mother's house. It's one of the things I'm like really looking forward to, because she's gonna feed me and we're just gonna laugh at, you know, like silly stories. And that's something I really miss about home. One of the things I really, really, really like to do is to go with my friends to like a bar. You know, I said earlier on like partying in Kenya. I want to make a distinction. I feel like actually we don't have clubs in Kenya, we have bars. It's a very different experience. And I think it's, now that I think about it, it's a very Kenyan thing. And I remember like reading some kind of criticism of like, oh, Kenyans don't dance, they just like sit on their chairs, drink whatever the beers or whatever they're drinking, and and talk. And actually that's what I'm usually really looking forward to when I go home, like meeting with my friends. And we're gonna go to a nice bar, usually a bar with a garden or outdoors. And we're gonna have some drinks and just talk with my friends for hours. I feel like we really process the country, we process our lives, we process pop culture, we process everything in like those moments, and it's happening like in a bar. And I'm always like really looking forward to that. um it's such a perfect mix, because it's like you usually have some kind of like grilled meat platters is what you're probably going to eat with beers or maybe tequila shots or something. And sometimes we're out until 3 4 in the morning, 6 in the morning, and we were literally talking. Now that I think about it, it's not a common experience, because I think when you go to a lot of places and there's a lot of like, when I see snippets of like um Nigerian clubs, when I see snippets of South African clubs, Ghanaian clubs, as people are dancing, there's a lot of dancing. Kenya, we're talking. We're a nation of talkers. I love to go to the Kenyan coast. I feel like we have the best beaches in the world. I have not been to all of the beaches, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been to quite a number of beaches, and every time I'm like, you know what, I should have just booked a flight and gone home. It's just perfect. Like the weather's perfect. Eat really good food. I really love like the food on the Kenyan coast. Two things I really like about home. I think we make really good furniture. We call it the Juakali industry, which actually translates to hot sun industry, because it's artisans. That's the word, artisans, and they're normally working outdoors. And when I lived in Nairobi 5 years ago, I lived on Gong Road, and along Gong Road, there's just like a bunch of those like furniture artisans, and you see the most beautiful furniture just like along the road, like spread out, and you can literally like park your car and like go and haggle and bargain and buy something, balcony chairs or whatever. And I actually really miss that about home. Like I could have an idea about something and I could go to Ngong Road, I could show them a picture, we could go back and forth. I can choose the wood, and I can design something like very bespoke. And a lot of times when I see the furniture, especially like this last 5 years, moving countries quite a bit, I've really missed the furniture, like the furniture options back home. So I like to do that sometimes just to go and see what the artisans are doing because they are very talented. And every time I feel like every time I go back, the quality of stuff is going like higher and higher. So I like to do that. And maybe buy a little bit something to bring back with me to give me like a little taste of home. And I also really like to check out the new artists. So if there's like a new gallery, I think Kenya is quite different from like maybe South Africa and Nigeria and a lot of other African countries because we essentially had a dictatorship for 24 years in beginning from the 80s to the 90s. And during that time, the art was really kind of like the government was like really stumping down on art because there was obvious, art is often a medium of critique, and a medium of protest. And the government at that time was really cracking down on writers, on artists, on singers. And I feel like after that um, government fell, I feel like there was like a boom and there's a proliferation in certain ways. I feel like the Kenyan art industry is very young. It's very nascent. It's coming up in a lot of ways, but also in the same vein, I think I find it very kind of like inventive. It's going into very new and interesting places. It's very experimental as well. So I like to try and see like what's happening, what interesting things are happening, and I guess for me, it's a way for me to because after sometimes going back is always a little bit bittersweet because I'm like I feel like I'm going back home, but also I feel like it's sometimes a little bit strange to me. Like it's not the same home that I left. So it's like old lovers that are like reconnecting and it's a bit strange and you're trying to figure out if you still fit together. And sometimes I think have I changed too much for the place or has the place changed too much for me? And we're kind of like trying to figure it out. And so I feel like art and music is a way for me to kind of like reintroduce myself to like the country and like what are people thinking about? What are people writing about? What are their aspirations? When I went to Senegal, when I went to Dakar, I felt the accent was a lot more mature. Like I felt like the quality of the work was amazing. I felt like the artists were asking very interesting questions. I think it's a very mature city when it comes to art, country in general. And I remember saying to a friend that I think personally that it's because the first president, Leopold Sedar Senghor, was an author and he was really about the arts. And after I said that to myself, now when I go to African cities, I try to kind of figure out like what their signature is. I remember going to Ghana and like Ghana is very like you can tell you can tell the roots of Pan-Africanism and like Kwame Nkrumah because the way they treat people, the kind of art when you go to bars and bookshops, it's you can very much see this kind of like connection of like trying to connect all the African countries. You can still see the roots of that. And so when I think about Kenya, I wonder what our thing is. Maybe it goes back to land. If maybe somebody has a designer bag and someone's like, oh my gosh, that's the price of like a 1 by 8 in Rural, it's which like we measure life by the cost of land and by like pieces of land. So maybe that's our obsession with land is like our thing. Immediately, I might say northeastern because, like I said, like from a landscape perspective, like we have the beautiful Indian Ocean coast that everybody knows. I think I've read about Lamu in Vogue, I think, and like everybody talks about Lamu, Malindi, Diani, very beautiful names, by the way, Kilifi. In 2020, during COVID, because we couldn't travel out of the country, and we did have lockdown, but at some point the government opened up, and we could travel, but we still had a curfew. And me and my partner decided to travel throughout the country a lot more. And I discovered a lot of places that I wouldn't maybe have thought of going before as kind of like as a tourist at home. And I went, and I think I really fell in love with like this little like Kenyan towns, that made me very curious about visiting other little African towns as well, because a lot of stuff is happening there as well, and people are doing very interesting things in those places as well. There's a lot to discover, save for the landscapes. I mean, other than the landscape, which is also, I mean, very beautiful. But there's also like, what do they eat? How do they um, prepare the meats? This kind of things for me, it's very interesting. How do they preserve their food? Um, what do they know about? Like, I met this guy who taught me about the small five. I only knew about the big five in nature, but he was teaching us about like the small five, and teaching us about what leaves you can use if you have malaria, and just all of this like knowledge that people have in other it's not city knowledge, it's like knowledge how to live of the land and on the land. And I love those experiences. But if it's like, like for tourism, I also really want to see the northeastern part of Kenya. It's desert, it's dry. We have a desert in in parts of Kenya. It's very beautiful from the photos I've seen. I haven't been. I've been wanting to go for a while. I think that's kind of like very undiscovered, but I think I've seen some very magical photos, and I think that's a place that's kind of like underrated. My favorite food is, I love what we call kienyeji chicken, which is like the chickens that are running around the village, the ones where the meat is very tough, but you have to boil it for hours. I love when that's prepared with like a very nice stew. I really love that chicken. But when I lived in Kenya, when I would shop in the supermarket, we don't have things labeled organic, but that's because most stuff was organic, so it wasn't like a thing. So I like it when my mom prepares it with just like some chili peppers, and she makes like a nice stew out of it, and I have that with ugali. One thing I really miss is the vegetables. We have this like beta indigenous vegetables. Chinsaga is one. This is in Kisii. We call it chinsaga. We have managu. I love this. So there's a joke that like Texas and Minnesota especially, there's a lot of Kisii community that they moved to Minnesota, and apparently my mom always tells me, if you go to Minnesota, you're going to get managu because they grew it there, and you're going to get chinsaga because they get it there. So I feel like I really miss that. Vegetables is another thing that I took really for granted. And I think Kenya being on the equator and with the soil being what it is, I think the quality of the food and the veggies and the meat, it's actually really quite good. On my mom's side, they have this milk. It's called ruranos, but it's basically like fermented milk, right? So it's not exactly like yogurt. It doesn't have the same consistency as yogurt because it has this like pulp in it, but it has a very specific consistency. It's a little bit sour, but I think like when you're having that with the bitter veggies, and the ugali would usually doesn't have any specific taste, but everything else, it's kind of like the accompaniment. And then the chicken stew with some chili, oh my god, like that for me is that's just heaven. So obviously, I have to mention my dear friend, and amazing artist, April Kamunde. She's a visual artist. She had a huge solo exhibition last year, which I missed. I really love her work because I have to say I'm like super biased towards like work that it's kind of like dealing with not women's issues per se, but like women's interiority, like the interior lives. And she did this series on rest, where she was featuring like the dira, which I guess in Kenya, we got from the Somali community, and the dira is a symbol of rest, because usually when you come home from work and you take off your bra, you put on a dira, and you're just kind of like it's free and loose and flowing, and like you feel just immediately relaxed. Or like on a Sunday, if you're just like chilling in your house. Her work, I found it just so moving in a very quiet, simple way. If you go to the media, or even if you read like a lot of popular books by African writers or other writers centering African women, there's a lot of stories about like the struggle and the struggles we face, and like the things we're trying to achieve, which is good. And I really relate with those stories as well. But it was really good to see visually just kind of like African women in states of rest. And she was doing portraits of her friends. So a lot of it is like, she's working with people that she knows. But it was just so beautiful. Generally, I really like her work. I think she does such interesting things with light. And I think she asks very interesting questions as well. So I would definitely shout her out. I also want to talk about another artist who is quite young. I really like his work. It's very kind of like charged and like frenetic. That's the word I would describe his work as, like very frenetic. His name is Alan Simba. He makes very colorful, charged work. I imagine him painting like in a frenzy, like a lot is happening, but it always makes me immediately like pick up. I feel like his art, when I look at his work, I feel psyched up. It gives me like a pep in my walk. And there's one artist that I don't have much of her work. I discovered her at the Affordable Art Show in Nairobi. She's called Wambui, and she does this very huge pieces, which are like um, beaded works. So I also find them very kind of like light, airy, uplifting, and I really like the use of beads. It makes the work come alive in a very physical way as well. And music, I really, really, really love Blinky Bill. He has a very decent body of work. I find his work is very Nairobi culture in terms of like the tempo, the beat, the samples. Um, it's definitely very it's what a lot of people back home would call alternative, but I think it's also very experimental, and I really like that. I think he's done very interesting things with his sound that we hadn't really seen in a big way in the Kenyan space. So yeah, so we have this thing we call Kenyanisms, which is like things that we say, I guess, that are it's a mix match of things. So Swahili language has what are popular called African proverbs, a lot of those, and what they are is in Swahili we call them methalis. So this is, Python saying that's like super succinct and it evokes something. What I really like about that is and we say that they were said by Wahenga, which is like elders, people wise people of yore. And so in school during exams, they would put half of a methali and you have to complete the other half, and we had to cram all of this. But I really like culturally what's that's done, because now we have a bunch of this kind of like sayings that we have. um it's so interesting because in matatus and in buses, so they normally have little stickers. Usually they're white with red font and they have a border around them, and they will have some kind of saying, but usually there's something a little bit tricky, a little bit snarky. For example, like you could see something like, and I will translate, it's a little bit tricky, but you'll see something like dira bila tako ni kanzu, right? Which basically says like, if you don't have nyash and you wear a dira, right? That's no longer a dira, it's a kanzu, like what the men wear. So you have this kind of like cheeky, playful, silly, irreverent type of sayings, and usually like they'll have a bunch of different ones, and I think they change them quite a bit. Um, One of my favorite ones though is I love Kwanini Kesho. I love Konini Kesho because Konini Kesho is what you say when you decided to have another shot of tequila instead of going home at the club. It basically translates to tomorrow never comes. So the moment is here now, So let's live now and today. Like life is to be lived today. I really like that. So I mean, if I'm treating myself to something, sometimes, I'll be like, Kwanini kesho, and then I will do that. I like that. I like saying that. It's a little bit tricky. I also like Boro Hai, which translates to, we translate it in broken English directly because we also say the English version, which is of importance is life. And basically just means that, like, what matters is that one is alive and well, and then everything else you can figure it out. So I say Boro Hai, after, if something has happened and I'm feeling down and out of myself, I just say, what, Boro Hai. Like, as long as you know, I'm here and I can live to fight or die another day, then Boro Hai. So I like that. Yeah. There's so much that I realize now that I took for granted. I keep saying that Nairobi is perfect place for a city. I think it's such a beautiful name for a city. The land was owned by the Maasai people, and they named it Nairobi, which translates to place of cool waters in the Maasai language. It's at the perfect level of elevation. When Nairobi housing, we hardly ever need heaters and we hardly ever need air conditioning. What home means, I think I understood it in a very different way, because it's kind of like there's ways in which I don't have to explain myself when I'm in Nairobi, the things I don't have to say. I don't have to explain why I find something funny, because it's kind of like a shared sense of humor, I guess, with the people that helped me build it, because I guess we share one sense of humor. Um, I don't have to, I can just give a look to someone in a public space because something happened, and like we're having like a communication. There's that, those forms of small, easy, daily, intimate communications with strangers. I miss that a lot. I could walk into a street in Nairobi and just know, like, perhaps I shouldn't be walking in this street. This is not, I just have this kind of like an intuitive sense of knowing of place and my sense of place within the city. I don't always have that here. I'm still filling it out and learning, and I guess it's still also learning me as well. So I miss those very kind of like inexplicable um, ways of belonging. On the occasion that I go on TikTok and I go on Instagram, I'm mostly looking for the reels to just see like the jokes that people are cracking, what people find funny, the skits that people are making, because I always find in that like just some sense of connection. I'm gonna say land. Interesting. I haven't spoken about the wildlife. When people hear here I'm from Kenya, they always talk about the wildlife. And I love to take a trip to a national park. I've taken several. I love to drive myself. So it's crazy that I haven't even spoken about that. But because of the land issue and the colonial history, and the fact that we're one of the top wildlife destinations in the world, we have like some people, usually not um, local or indigenous Kenyans, that come to Kenya and get access to big chunks of land for purposes of conserving, the wildlife, um, which I find a little bit problematic, because we have been living with our wildlife in Africa and in Kenya. Like they came and they found us there living with the wildlife side by side. Our wildlife has not gone extinct. Um, so we know how to live, with the wildlife. And people grab huge tracts of lands for themselves in the name of conservation. And I see what that does to like the local communities and the kind of dependencies that it creates. So, and of course, with the political class often being sort of like, at the center of it somehow. I think that's something that for me I find incredibly sad, and it's something that I think the access to land, who has access to land, and who has access to, who gets to make the choices, even the decisions, and who's passing the policies on what does preserving our wildlife look like for us, and what can we learn from the people that have lived with these animals side by side for so long. I think that for me is kind of like a big one. I think there's the question of like the the access to land, and the question of access to water, ability to like feed ourselves. Today, when I see the costs of like organic food, it makes me realize that it was a kind of paradise that we were living in, with good access to good quality food that's not you know prohibitively expensive for most people. Yes, we've had droughts, but and I think that's more a question of like organization of how the food goes around the country, because we are able to feed ourselves. So I think for me that it goes back to land access, and then with the land access it comes back to what are we doing with the land, how do we feed ourselves, how do we live, how do we cohabit with animals, preserve the wildlife, but ensure that human life, it's also kind of like respected. Because people find Nairobi to be a very like a modern city with skyscrapers and a highway or the other always coming up. There's always that question between like um Nairobi is very green. Lots of We have, I think, two big forests in the city, and Wangari Maathai, first Kenyan, first African woman, I think, to win the Nobel Peace Prize, literally won it for fighting for trees. And stopping the grabbing of public land like parks. And that tension is still there today in the country. And again, I think it goes back to land, but that question of, like we want to continue to have trees. um, we want to continue to have public access to land that is green and beautiful. And there's always some kind of tension between that and the political class and their ideas of what development must look like. And there's always a very strong push that, development doesn't have to mean malls, it can also mean public parks. Development doesn't have to mean skyscrapers only. We can also have parks. It doesn't have to mean 30 floor height apartments. We need parks, and it shouldn't be curb road everywhere. We want to see some grass. So that tension also, I think, for me is like a big thing, and it's something that I'm always paying attention to. Yeah.